associate professor of political science at Quinnipiac University. I've been at Quinnipiac since 2011. On our main campus, we serve about 2,500 undergraduates, and there are 2 Black male full-time faculty members. So I attended public schools, kindergarten through my PhD, and in elementary school never had a Black male educator, not even a dean of instruction or of behavior. I didn't have my first Black male teacher until sophomore year of high school. I think it didn't really have an impact on me, but I definitely saw the impact it had on my classmates to have a Black male teacher of physics who was there in the classroom, and not just someone who was there to correct their behavior, but to really push them to learn, particularly for other men who were students with me, but also for women who had never seen a Black male in the position of being an educator. So I think overall, if we look at the number of Black men who are enrolled in college, that number has decreased over time. So that has an impact on the number of Black men or men of color who are going into education as a field. But it also means that for those who do go to college, the field becomes more competitive. So if you now have the opportunity to become an engineer or an entrepreneur and make more money, it is a tough sell to say, go into education where you can really improve lives. So there are a number of factors at play, some of them being financial, some of them seeing yourself on the other side of the classroom. So we spend a lot of time telling young Black men to go to college. It makes a difference when they go there and they don't see people who look like them or who want to invest in them. So I think it's important for young kids to see people who look like them, but it's even more important that they see people who believe in them and see them as potential and possibility and not just as a problem. And I think it's important for kids, not just for Black kids to see Black teachers, but for non-Black students to see people of color in those positions as well. It gives them a sense of the ability to overcome stereotypes so that they understand people can succeed in whatever field they choose. It helps them to understand that being proud of who you are doesn't mean that you can't invest in other people. But I also think it's important for our schools to reflect the communities that we live in. And if we live in an increasingly diverse community, an increasingly diverse world, we need to start that very early on for kids in education. I think one of the things that is an important legacy of the Brown v. Board decision is that America's schools are more segregated now than they ever have been. And they're segregated in terms of class. So people who have money or upward mobility are less likely to send their kids to public schools or to inner city schools. We've become more segregated when it comes to language and English language learners and our support of that. But there's also a loss of having teachers and educators who know you as a student, who know your family, who know your community, because you go to the same house of worship or you run into each other in the supermarket. And being able to see you as a whole person, not just as a number and a statistic, it makes a difference. So I think the real question now when it comes to the legacy of Brown v. Board is what was lost with that decision and how do we regain that? How do we build community inside of our schools so that we can have a better relationship outside of the schools? So the question of did Brown v. Board dismantle the system or did it really displace people? So we don't have quantitative data to really show the before and after effect, but we do have the narratives and the qualitative piece there to talk to people who went through segregated schools and to say it meant something to them, that the teachers believed in them, that even though they didn't have the same level of resources, so textbooks and materials as other schools, they had teachers who were willing to work with them outside of schools. They had educators who had very high expectations and didn't accept excuses. So I think those kinds of stories, that kind of qualitative data is just as important because we know that we have a widening achievement gap in our country, and often it has nothing to do with social class. So why is that? Is it because we don't think kids can achieve now, or are we just not measuring that achievement the way that we did before Brown v. Board? And particularly in a state like Connecticut, which is battling over school funding and the amount of money and resources that our inner city schools receive as opposed to our suburban schools. understanding the real goal of Brown v. Board and how we reach that goal is more important than ever before. Well, I think one of the issues in terms of awareness is helping people to understand why it's a problem that we don't have more Black male educators. What does it send as a message to young people that the only time they encounter Black men in schools is when they've gotten in trouble and they've been sent to them to discipline? It creates the expectation that Black men are there in an adversarial role. It also has a lot to do with school climate and school culture. So we need to hear from students why they think it's a problem. It's one thing for me as a parent and as a taxpayer to say why I think it's problematic, but why do students think it's problematic? And what does it mean when they go to colleges and universities where it's even, less likely that they will have a Black male professor or female professor in the classroom? What does that mean for how they see themselves? And I think that if we can establish why it's a problem, then we need to commit resources to that so that colleges and universities create scholarships and pipelines to increase the number of Black male educators, that school systems create outreach programs and relationships with historically Black colleges and universities to increase that pipeline to get more people into the school system. Because kids don't just stay in school for 8 hours a day. They go home to their communities and they need to have those basic interpersonal experiences. I think it is particularly important for urban students to have people in the classroom who look like them. It's even more important that they have people who are willing to invest in them, not just as a student, but really as a whole child. So if we look at all the psychological research, it shows that students perform to the expectations that we have of them. So if we get trapped in the tragedy of low expectations, that's all those students are going to do. So to have people who say, look, I know you may be dealing with challenges at home or in the neighborhood, but that cannot be an excuse for your success. Because in many ways, if you have an educator, person of color, they've overcome some personal strife as well. So that kind of connection. But I also think it's an important symbol and signal for non-students of color, for majority students to see people in positions of authority as educators who are just as smart as anyone else and can really challenge the way that they think about them. I think one of the greatest tragedies of Brown v. Board is that it encouraged people to become comfortable and complacent. That people thought that if they could get a degree, if they could wear their organizational affiliations on their lapel, somehow they had made it. And one of the things we've realized over the last 50 years is that those degrees don't protect us. Those titles don't shield us. And having educators who could say to people, even with your degree and your education, you have an obligation to make things better. We've lost that. People move outside of the community. They don't really connect with those grassroots-based organizations anymore. They don't get to know families. They don't get to know what it means that little Johnny is catching hell at home, and that's why he can't really pay attention in school. There is a way to affirm the importance of community without going back to the pre-Brown days of improperly funding schools based on where they are. So how we can recapture and reclaim the spirit of pre-Brown that said schools are public goods that have a community-based component is what we need to invest in now. So I think one of the things that we hear in terms of the current tone, in terms of legal cases, is that there's a pipeline problem. That districts really want to hire a diverse faculty, but they simply don't have the people who are there. And I kind of feel like that's an excuse, because if you really believe there's a pipeline problem, then you create the pipeline. It doesn't mean that you hire people just because they're Black or just because they're male. You hire them because they have the experience and the skill set, but you make an active commitment to going out and finding them. And, one of the things that I think works is creating a pipeline with historically Black colleges and universities, creating scholarship programs so that young people, young men coming out of high school see education as a pathway and know that once they've made it through education, they come back, they have some assistance paying off their student loans, and can actually make a commitment to young people in the community. That is not the sense of affirmative action that says we're going to have set-asides and quotas. It is just that in evaluating candidates that in terms of credentials are similarly situated, our preference is that we have someone who can add to our district that which we lack. there are legal ways to maneuver that if the district is really committed to it. So I think the first step in terms of navigating administrative support is that administrators, districts need to stop treating Black men who are successful as unicorns. That instead of seeing them as an exception to the rule, you say, look, we know that there are a plethora of men in our community who can step up and step in to educate our kids. And that doesn't mean that we rely on them for their physical strength or that we put them in a position where they're automatically seen in a negative light because it's an adversarial position. So that's providing the support. What does it mean that if you know you're underrepresented, what does it mean for how parents deal with you? And how can administrators support those conversations? How do you overcome the sort of implicit bias that has people seeing Black and thinking criminal? If we see that in broader society, certainly we see that in the school systems. How do we help students understand what that relationship might be so that they don't look at their Black male teacher as the cool teacher that they can call by their first name and not show the same level of respect and deference that they would to other people? And that's not just about looking at how white students interact with Black teachers, but also how other teachers interact with one another. What are the expectations that we bring? And do we run to our Black male colleagues when there's a problem because we think you can relate to that student better? Having those same expectations is key. Understanding the different needs is imperative so that you have retention. It's not just about diversity. It's really about inclusion and retention and mutual respect. So I think one of the issues in terms of perceptions of where we think Black men should be or where we think men should be more broadly is about us taking a step back and understanding what are the biases that we hold. So why is it that we think Black men can't be tender? Why is it that we don't think that Black men can understand the socio-emotional needs of a kindergartner as opposed to a ninth grader? Why does it make us uncomfortable to see a Black male teacher embrace his student and be able to say, I know you're dealing with something, I'm here for you. Yes, we need to get this math done, but I also need to understand what challenges you're bringing to school. For me, it's important that we do that early on. Right? So the same way that we have this misconception that Black men are absentee fathers, we can't reinforce that by having them as absentee teachers because we don't think we can handle what that means. And so in some ways, school systems reinforce the very biases and stereotypes that they claim to be fighting against. So just as we don't put Black male teachers really in the K-8 space, we also end up putting them in, the punishment space. So again, if a system is designed for student achievement that is complemented by faculty achievement and teacher achievement, we have to be willing to be that beacon. We have to be willing to disrupt society's expectations, and that has to start really at pre-K.